has done with the motivations and the outcomes of Gallipoli. People will take that same issue with Vietnam, but I think they'll remember that a lot of Australian men and women strove mightily, pretty successfully, and sometimes tragically were killed and maimed and left scarred mentally for the rest of their lives. So in all of that, I think people will do what they do about our military history. They will think of the human dimension. And that's why I'm concerned that there's this, you keep asserting that our schools are hotbeds of sort of Union Jack waving Lord Kitcheners running around saying Australia got made at Gallipoli. I don't think so. I think you'd be intrigued to hear what went on in classrooms. I think it's more to do with what I see them doing at Mackay North State High School, a pilgrimage out to the battlefields, not to see where Australia made its bones, you know, became a nation, but to discover the fate of relatives and people from the Mackay district. And they've been doing that for years and years. That's typical of a lot of schools where teachers have made something positive out of the ANZAC experience rather than, you know, this sort of mantra that you're claiming in your book.
At Mackay, do they then take the children out to see the sites of Aboriginal massacres?
Well, I'm not aware of that.
Henry, you write about the high level of government funding in schools over the past 15 years towards the ANZAC Day and a misguided view of history. Now, is this sort of something that Australia's may have raised a generation of nationalist-minded people, and that could be sort of contributing to events such as Cronulla riots and other circumstances where people bind together under an Aussie pride situation?
Henry Reynolds.
Yes, I don't know about that. It's a very interesting question, but I suspect it's a very difficult one to try and get a precise answer to. But certainly what concerns me is the extent to which government has now involved itself in promoting a particular view of history, and one which emphasises the military nature of our history. Now, this is unprecedented. And it's also unprecedented in the extent to which it's involved children. It's a degree of promoting a particular view among children that is unusual in Western democracies. And therefore, this disturbs me. And as I said before, because it distorts the rest of the story.
I think we could. I mean, I'd take your previous point about when you talked about the high school in Mackay, where they're learning about our military history. It would be good to learn about our Aboriginal history. When I was growing up at Peach Ridge, we had Aboriginal carvings within 200 metres of our farm. I never thought to ask myself what happened to those people. And with my son not long ago, I was playing chess. And I was white and he was black, and I was winning, and he started crying. And I said, why? And he said, because this reminds me of what happened to the Aboriginal people. And I thought that, I mean, that was a generation of difference. And I think things like, for we Australians, the Mile Creek Massacre. All Australians should know about the Mile Creek Massacre, what happened there, and that we have that is on our record, and as a nation to know ourselves, if we know that, we can also know the ANZAC, and I agree, we shouldn't just know the ANZAC. What
new legend can we build to nourish our grandchildren and their children, and why can't we have a new hero, a civil and global peace builder who will fight for a more equitable world?
Henry Reynolds, let's start with you.
I think that's a wonderful question. My problem with ANZAC isn't the fact that the society and individuals mourn and grieve for those who have been killed and injured. It is what's built upon that, and that is that ANZAC had a special place because it helped create the nation. In fact, there are many, many people who will say the nation was born on the shores of Gallipoli. Now, this I find deeply disturbing for two reasons. Now, the first one is that it totally dismisses what had happened before 1914. If you look at Australia on the eve of the First World War, it was one of the most successful societies in the world. It was the most democratic, it had the highest standard of living, it was the envy of the world. And yet we say it wasn't a nation. It became a nation when the young men went ashore in Turkey. Now, that is an extraordinary proposition. It suggests that a week of war is more important than a year of nation building. It totally eclipses 60 years of very significant nation building. Now, therefore, it is a distortion of the true story of Australia.
My question is, why is there so little acknowledgement of the role played by Aboriginal soldiers? Hundreds of Aborigines served in all overseas wars and many were killed. How could we better highlight their involvement and show that notions of sacrifice and defending one's country aren't only white Australian characteristics, but were also demonstrated by Aboriginal diggers?
All right, let's start with Henry Reynolds. Let's start with this fact. I believe 5 Aboriginal diggers died at Gallipoli. Was their sacrifice ever properly recognised?
I honestly don't know. I mean, I think in the First World War, as we know, the Aborigines, when they returned to their appalling condition of not having rights that others had, of not having many of the rights that returned soldiers had, and indeed we treated returned Aboriginal soldiers very shabbily. The Second World War may well have been different, and I think now...
Well, wait, can I just interrupt there? We didn't only treat them shabbily. They were excluded from military pensions. Their wives did not get widows' pensions. They weren't entitled for resettlement benefits or land as white soldiers
But
were.
if I went into that detail, you would have cut me off.
Well, no, I was hoping you might go into that. When you think about this, is it somehow a shame on the nation that those servicemen did not get the recognition at the time, did not get pensions, their widows did not get widows' pensions?
Yeah, of course it is. I mean, any inequity after people had been away and taken sort of lethal risks, many of them lost their lives, estimating this number of 5 of 8,000 Australians buried at Gallipoli. But they would have been regarded simply as another Australian, and for them to not have benefits on their return was truly shameful. But so was the rest of society's regard for and treatment of Indigenous people at the time. And to single out the military as being somehow especially remiss in this regard is, I think, a little bit, I think it's a bit unfair, Henry.
The other thing you have to remember is if you're looking for an army that actually did try to defend its homeland as distinct from invading somebody else's, it's the Aboriginal peoples. And one of the things we've done to them is deny that they fought any war at all about their own land. And there's plenty of evidence that they did.
Okay.
Yeah, pardon me. My question is to Henry Reynolds. C.E.W. Bean, who laid the foundation of the ANZAC legend with his official history of World War I, has been accused of excluding the negative aspects of what Australian soldiers might have done. For example, desertion or mistreatment of prisoners. Doesn't this, at best, make the ANZAC legend a half-truth and at worst make it a lie?
Henry Reynolds, we'll start off with you.
Well, certainly a half-truth. I mean, one of the things that is not understood is just how strict the censorship was, that people in Australia learned little about the realities of the conflict, particularly once it got to the Western Front. Now, Bean himself was part of this. He felt it was important indeed to present a picture of war which was heroic, that left out much of what was unpleasant. And certainly there was never any talk in the official propaganda about, indeed, the Australians having a reputation for being particularly brutal, that is, killing prisoners and bayoneting the wounded. So all of these things were quite obviously left out, and Bean himself felt that he had to present a story that could be read profitably and happily by Australian families. So therefore he was an official war historian. He wasn't an independent critical journalist, and therefore what he presented was indeed a very, very much distorted picture. But as I say, remember, this was a volunteer army. There was no conscription in Australia. They had to present a picture which would encourage people to go on volunteering, and that's part of the reason why Australia got a fairly distorted picture of the conflict.
Let's hear from Peter Fitzsimons.